Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, Solidarity has launched a legal challenge against the electricity state of disaster. They want it to be declared unlawful and argue that it doesn't meet the definition of a disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act. Let's speak now more on this with the lobby group's head of legal affairs, Anton Van Der Bijl. Anton, good morning and thank you very much for your time. So the SONA debate continues today and many opposition MPs have come down hard on the president, particularly on the interventions outlined to deal with the energy crisis that we're talking about today. You have resolved to challenge the state of disaster declaration in court. What exactly are your concerns around this intervention?
Yes, morning, Bondu. We are in court on the 14th of March, and in essence, our application is an application for review. We say that the decision to declare the national state of disaster is irrational. And why we say so is due to the following. We say in terms of the Disaster Management Act, disaster can only be enacted if it falls within the ambit of the framework of that specific act. So therefore, a crisis must be unforeseen, it must be extraordinary, and there must be no other means to alleviate the consequences of the disaster. We say this disaster or this crisis is not unforeseen. This is the effect of 16 years of mismanagement of Eskom. So this is not unforeseen. It has been coming for the past 16 years. So why do we call now state of disaster? It's not extraordinary. If you look at the state departments and the state-owned companies, then every one of those is in some sort of crisis. So this is not something extraordinary. We need a good management of our state-owned companies and not a state of disaster. And lastly, we say there's ample tools in the government's toolbox to deal with the situation. Look at the Public Finance Management Act, look at the Electricity Generation Act, and then you'll see that there's a lot of tools that can be used to alleviate this crisis.
Let's talk about those tools, because if you're saying that it can be implemented with existing legislation, let's say, for instance, the expediting of the public consultation process that would come with the IPPs. They're mandatory, those public consultation process, and ordinarily take months. What would happen with just the legislative instruments that we have now? How would one be able to expedite? Because that is an argument that they put forward, that some of the others, you can, yes, decide to fast-track other aspects of the procurement process. You could even exempt perhaps your hospitals and hospital and schools. That can be done. But things such as the public consultations that take months and you cannot do away with, how would you expedite that?
Well, if you look at the Electricity Generation Act, then the Minister of Energy has an obligation to set out a plan each and every 2 years in terms of how energy and electricity will be used and how it will be achieved. You'll see that I think it's in June 2020, there was an emergency procurement policy or framework for the procurement of IPPs was put in place, and that happened only by a regulation of the Minister of Energy. That was put in place, I think, about in a space of a month or two. So to enact a state of disaster to procure private energy is not the way to go. You have the Electricity Regulatory Act. You have the Public Finance Management Act, and that can be used.
Now, your views that this is some sort of a man-made crisis is a position that has been expressed by a number of political analysts that we've been engaging on this platform. And all of them cannot deny that nevertheless we are in crisis, that whether it is man-made because of misgovernance for many, many years, they're all arguing that, though, at the end of the day, we are in crisis. So are you denying that we're in crisis at this point, or you're saying, yes, there is a crisis, but the state of disaster is most certainly not the way to go?
No, we accept fully that there's a crisis. To sit each and every day in a few hours of darkness, I think the most hardiest of naysayers will convert to accepting that there is a crisis. So there is a crisis. But there's a differentiation between a crisis and the national state of disaster. wherein unfettered rights are given to the government to deal with such a crisis. We say this is not a national state of disaster. There is a crisis, there is tools available to the government to deal with the crisis, to enact the state of disaster where more power is given to the same entity which has mismanaged this crisis for the past 16 years is absolutely ridiculous. We say the state must do what they need to do, not what they want to do or say they want to do to save face in the elections of next year. They need to do what they need to do within the prescripts and framework of the acts, and they can do that.
So you weren't particularly moved when the president stated that as a means to guard against abuse of funds, perhaps there would be the presence of the Auditor General, where the Auditor General in this particular disaster would play a more central role. You were not moved by that, or perhaps a bit convinced?
No, not in the least moved. The Auditor General was also part and parcel of the previous national state of disaster in terms of the COVID pandemic, and the Auditor General's reports were quite clear the extent of the corruption that took place. So to argue now if the Auditor General is going to prevent corruption and the like, that's absolutely ridiculous. The Auditor General has a duty to, in any event, without a state of disaster, to look at the dealings of state-owned companies and state departments.
And then outside of the state of disaster, just to get your views on the electricity ministry, your views on that?
Yeah, that's going to be quite interesting. You have a new electricity minister, then you have the energy minister, then you have the Kochta minister, which is the manager of the state of the disaster, and then you have the minister of public works. So you have, in effect, 4 managers of this disaster and of the crisis. That's going to play out is going to be quite interesting. We have seen that, unfortunately, government doesn't do good when there's too many cooks in the kitchen. So we'll see what happens, but I don't hold my breath that something will happen with a new minister in place.
It will be quite interesting indeed, because as we've heard, that Public Enterprises Minister will remain the shareholder representative, meaning the board will engage with DPE, but then you've got an electricity minister, so one wonders who will be briefing the electricity minister. Will it be DPE's minister briefing them on what the board has decided, or they'll both now engage the board of Eskom? Quite an interesting one. But Anton, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's Solidarity's Head of Legal Affairs, Anton Van Der Bijl.